Hello, everyone. I'm Traci. I am from the reference department. I want to thank you all for coming out today. This is the Women Also Served, Part 2, the WAC. If you missed the first one, which we did in March, it was the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. But today we are going to talk about the women that were in the Army during the Second World War. So after World War II, men were memorialized through books, movies, documentaries, and much more. Their stories were shared worldwide and admired by generations surrounding them. The war was officially over on September 2nd. Japan surrendered. The Axis powers in Europe had surrendered a few months earlier in May. Men were hailed as heroes, and that was true. They served their countries well and gave their lives to keep the world a safe place for all people. However, that is only part of what happened during the war. So women had been involved in the war since the Revolutionary War. Molly Pitcher fought in the Revolutionary War against the British Army, loading cannons. In the Civil War, women served as nurses. And in World War I, they became informers, canteen workers, and nurses. In addition, they also worked the land and took over numerous jobs that men left behind. Women's roles in the Second World War were far more significant. Women were able to serve. They served in the Army with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. The Navy, women accepted for volunteer emergency services. The Coast Guard, Semper Paratus, meaning always ready. They even flew planes with the Women's Air Service pilots. The women who served during World War II, 432 of them would be killed during their wartime service. Initially, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was against having women in the military because he thought there would be what he called tremendous difficulties with this prospect. But Representative Charles Plumlee of Vermont said, "You cannot win this war without women." It was decided that women could be included in the military or civilian service, but men accused them of taking their jobs and didn't think women could fly the same planes or even had the same abilities that they did. How would they deal with combat? Men asked. They had heated debates as well how to treat and employ women during the war. The government decided women could only do non-combat roles. But despite every restriction, women wanted to help. They were determined to serve their country with dignity and strength. Some continued to be in the service after the wartime duties were complete. The women who served in World War II contributed to the war effort significantly in a variety of military roles, such as the WAC. They put their lives on the line for their country. Despite having to combat gender stereotypes, racial discrimination, not getting the credit they deserved, women contributed to the success of the war. But additionally, when they came home from duty, they received no recognition from their peers, and they were forced to go back to the sidelines. They watched men have a hero's welcome after rejoining their families, but for decades, women received almost no recognition from the general public for their contribution to the war effort. Scholars agree women were integral to the Allies' victory, but not many scholars, teachers, museum educators gave them the credit that they deserved for what they did, and in some cases weren't aware of what they did at all until recently. Of course, more and more women emerged wanting gender equality as time went on. Now there are museums and historic homes devoted to the women. It was not just the men who fought for the free world. Women served too. But how did their status as women, and in some cases, minority, racial, or religious backgrounds, affect their service? By 1941, it was difficult to know what part women would play in the war at all. Women were very excited about the prospect of volunteering if the opportunity arose. There were organizations such as the Chicago Defense League and the Los Angeles Women's Ambulance and Defense Corps that created military training programs. In March of 1941, after seeing the enthusiasm, George Marshall acknowledged the women who wanted to do their patriotic duty, but it was an uphill battle. How would a bill authorizing women to serve in the military pass in Congress? One congressman asked who would do the washing, the mending, or the cleaning. Not everybody was ready for women to be outside the home. Many men considered themselves the strong ones and still couldn't accept women to be in the military as anything but simply a nurse. Of the women's military branches, the WAC received the most pushback. Despite their impressive numbers and later integration into the Army in 1943, Congressman Andrew Lawrence Summers of New York said that the legislation establishing the WAC was the silliest piece of legislation that has ever come before my notice in the years that I have served here. A women's army to defend the United States of America? Think of the humiliation. What has become of manhood, of America, that we have to call on our women to do what has been ever the duty of men? The thing is so revolting to me, to my sense of decency, that I cannot discuss it. Luckily, the women had a staunch supporter in Congresswoman Edith Norris Rogers, who was beloved by her colleagues and supporters. Rogers had a keen interest in the military and fought for the rights for women who served in World War I. The politician drafted a bill to get women into the military. George Marshall counter-offered creating an auxiliary group under the Army with civilian status. He eventually agreed that it would be too radical to make women full members of the Army. After the bill sat in the committee for months, it was finally passed in May of 1942. Marshall and Secretary of War Henry Stimson had to meet with numerous congressmen who were not enthusiastic about the bill. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was authorized by President Roosevelt for non-combat service with the Army of the United States. Ovetta Cole-Pobby, a 37-year-old Texas, was named director. She was in the Women's Interest section in the War Department in the Bureau of Public Relations. She had attended law classes at the University of Texas and had been a legislative parliamentarian. Women were enthusiastic about joining the WAC. However, it was difficult to find women who qualified. Many were underweight. They were advised to eat a bunch of bananas or have a milkshake and come back and be weighed again at the end of the day to make the weight requirement of 105 pounds for training. Most women did not make the height requirement, which was 5 foot 6 inches. The workaround was to tease their hair. Hobby went all over the country trying to recruit women who could meet the requirements. The original WAC training center was in Des Moines, Iowa. People flocked to the station to see the women arriving. The women marched to the Army truck that drove them to their airbase. They got their uniforms and were assigned bunks. Every woman took an aptitude test to determine what jobs they were going to do for the Army. One WAC said, "They know exactly what you can do and how well you can do it." WACs woke up at 5:30 every morning to clean their barracks and then go to breakfast. Many of them attended classes and then had outdoor marching and calisthenics. Dinner was at 16:30 or 4:30 p.m., and then they were allowed to study and write letters home until they had to go to bed at 22 o'clock or 10 p.m. Congressmen worried that the woman would be shouted at, but there was no need for concern according to those who served. Their superiors were very pleased. It was easier to get the women to march than the men, and women never complained. An officer claimed they had never seen such spirit in a group. Most women did adjust well and excelled in training. Of course, there were some who felt officers played favorites, and others, such as Roberta House, felt inadequate and succumbed to the stress. For the most part, the biggest obstacle was their uniforms. First off, they were khaki, olive, and unflattering. For some, the uniforms were ill-fitting and up to a few sizes too large. Some clothes seemed like they had been previously used, and sometimes women had to wear men's gear. The ladies often complained the clothes weren't practical. However, it was a small price to pay. WAC officers tried to help those who found the adjustment more difficult, but most women did just fine. In the words of Jenny Lee, "Those gold bars meant more to me than anything I've ever done. I'm so damn proud I could die." It meant the world to women to be able to serve and help regardless of the stress it put on under them. Eventually, they got green olive uniforms, wool coats, skirts, and Garris caps. Employing women as anything more than nurses in the military was uncharted territory. Nobody knew how men would react when women were thrown into the mix. The WAC experience was overall positive regarding their interactions with men. Elizabeth Pollock remembers the women in her unit singing the praises of their male colonial. He was nice and kind. It seems like the men and women in the base struck a balance. The men asserted their masculinity, and the women their femininity. Pollock complained, "Everyone around here is terrified they'll lose their femininity. I haven't heard so much talk about ladies in all my life as I have since I came to the WAC." In a way, everyone was on the same page, that the women in the service might challenge the gender norms. S.E. Dobbs of the 6888 Central Postal Battalion remarked, "Some men did have a feeling that you should not be there, so you have to get used to the idea that you were not their favorite." While adjusting to military life, many WACs faced concerns from their families. Emma Love said, "She just about killed her mother because she said she was going to join the WAC." Violet Claude said her father was concerned, "What would the neighbors say?" Some women were even disowned by their families for joining up. There was a propaganda campaign against the WAC used to taint their efforts. Congressman Rogers slammed the rumors as absolutely and completely false. George Marshall and Henry Stimson backed her up. Marshall claimed it was defamation of as fine a group of women as I have ever assembled, And if we cannot be decent in such manners, we should at least not be as naive enough as to destroy ourselves. Aside from some whistles and catcalls, the women overall seem to get along well with men in the Army. The women here would be elevated from the WAC, WAAC, to WAC, removing the word auxiliary, on July 1st, 1943. They gained Army status, as well as equal pay, which before they were paid less than their male counterparts. This move was also integral to the war effort. Most men were happy to have the help, even if it was from women. Nearly all the women were very happy with their service experience. Every challenge the women faced seemed to be worth it, whether it was harassment, uniforms, or snide comments from their male counterparts. It meant the world to the women to be able to serve and help. In addition to women's ongoing struggle for equal treatment, the 1940s presented an especially difficult time for minority women. The United States was still segregated, the military no different. Some Black people were concerned having Oveta Kolpabi managing the WAC, as she was from Texas. They were concerned that she did not like Black people, like many other people from her home state. Black women had different quarters than white women. Oneida Miller recollected being called nigger many a time, but you just kept going. Black women were in separate units and treated differently from their white counterparts. The women at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, shared their stories of the time in the WAC. White women weren't the ones scrubbing the floors and working in the kitchens. These ladies were determined to accept nothing less than they deserved, even if it meant going to court over it. White women got the better jobs as translators and secretaries. Initially, Mary Green, Alice Young, Anna Morrison, and Johnny Murphy were excited when they heard that they were going to be transferred to Fort Devens, Massachusetts in late 1944. They were hoping to be medical personnel, and it was an exciting prospect for them. It didn't occur to them that the new work environment would be just as segregated as Des Moines, Iowa. When they arrived, they were not treated as they had hoped. It did not include being sent to the same barracks as the white WACs. These women had separate training programs, living facilities, and even recreational areas. To be able to treat the Black women this way, the government must have spent millions of dollars simply to treat them as second-class citizens. Very few Black women were assigned essential jobs. The 6888 Postal Battalion was the only Black unit to be sent over to Europe. However, many ended up doing menial jobs. They cleaned the floors and were errand runners. In the waning months of World War II, 855 women of color comprised the 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion, 824 enlisted soldiers, and 31 officers. They completed a time-sensitive mission in European theater. The Army thought that their success would be key in boosting morale among millions of weary American service members. The US government and the Red Cross workers stationed throughout Europe in 1945. And this mission was for the women to label, sort, and clear out millions of mail, including letters, gifts, photographs that had just been left in warehouses for months or years. One general predicted it would be around 6 months to process all the undelivered mail. But the 6888 did it in just 3. Alice Dixon said, "We're all human, whether black, white, red, or brown, and we all have something to offer." Due to segregation policies in the military at the time, black WACs could only constitute up to 10% of the overall force. It was far less. Charity Adams, a teacher who had been taking summer classes at The Ohio State University in 1942, was invited to apply for the WAC. In July of 42, Adams reported to Fort Des Moines, Iowa, to train in the first WAC officer training class. Despite living and training in a segregated environment, she excelled. She graduated in August of 42 and led the 3rd Company, 3rd Training Regiment, and was stationed in Fort Des Moines until 1944, when she worked as a station control and staff training officer. She was promoted to major in 1943. She was the highest ranking female officer in the fort and one of them in the nation. In 1944, Adams was given command of the 6888 Central Postal Battalion. After her overseas service, Adams was promoted to Lieutenant Colonial. Elaine Bennett joined the WAC because I wanted to prove to myself, and maybe to the world, that we, meaning African Americans, would give what we had back to the United States as a confirmation that we were full-fledged citizens. S.C. Woods joined the Army for similar reasons. I guess we got patriotic and carried away and enlisted. So that's really how it was, that feeling of wanting to do something. The 6888 went to Birmingham, England, with the women working around the clock in 3 8-hour shifts in dimly lit warehouses, surrounded by millions of pieces of mail, stacked from floor to ceiling. Then they were transferred to Rouen, France. They worked along French civilians and German prisoner of war to accomplish the next mission. And finally, they went to Paris. Years later, in March of 2022, the 855 women were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. The black women at Fort Devens decided to take action. 54 of them did not report to duty and went on strike. The women believed military failed these women, leading to a breakdown of morale by not meeting their needs as human beings. By March 1945, nearly every black woman at Fort Devens was on strike. The Army charged 6 women, Morrison, Green, Young, Murphy, and 2 others, with disobeying a commanding officer. The NAACP branch in Boston stepped in to help them. Julian D. Rainey, a lawyer from the branch, represented the women in court. He made his side of the case on discrimination and neglect of the women. He claimed they were monomaniac, a mind confused by something they couldn't understand because of the differentiation made between members of the armed forces because of color. This had driven them to excitement, which amounted to monomania, and they didn't know what they were doing. This was concurred by Colonial Walter Crandall, who stated that he did not have colored WACs as medical technicians. They are here to scrub the floors and do all the dirty work. Young admitted this type of work affected her mental health. It reminded her that she would never get to be a medical technician because of her race. Murphy echoed some of Young's thoughts when she mentioned that white women had several different types of jobs, and they had very few. According to their testimony, the racism was obvious. The tragic reality for these women was that despite bravely going to court and testifying against Army members, that at the time, the United States heavily favored white people. Although the Army had expert lawyers and Rainey was not as strong an attorney as they had hoped, it really didn't matter. The white group would always be favored. The women lost their fight and were found guilty. These women, however, did challenge the status quo in a way that had never been before. Their plight helped ignite the civil rights movement. Black women were not alone having issues in the WAC because of their race. Nisei women, or daughters of Japanese immigrants, also had difficulties because after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese people were labeled as untrustworthy or dangerous. They were not allowed to be part of the military until 1943. Around the same time, Oveta Kolpabi, director of the WAC, looked at data on the Japanese women in relocation centers. Later that year, the WAC would conduct interviews and recruit women from the centers. The women seemed enthusiastic about joining. However, their families would have to approve of their daughters going to the WAC. The families also refused to allow them to be segregated. For these women, luckily, the WAC decided not to segregate this group, but conducted investigations before accepting them. On July 23rd, 1943, it was official that women with Japanese ancestry would be able to join the ranks of the WAC. The government would only take 500 Nisei women into the program. The WAC needed more women, and this would be another way to get the recruits. It was a difficult process. In fact, when joining, they had to fill out a questionnaire to prove their loyalty to the United States and the Army. They were the only group to have a loyalty questionnaire. The United States clearly did not completely trust them because of their Japanese heritage. It was an overwhelming process to become a WAC if you were of Nisei origin, and the process could take months. For most of them, it was worth it. Private Shinagawa mentions, "It's a wonderful job for my people to actively participate in the greatest battle for democracy that the world has ever known. By joining, I found a true meaning of democracy." Kathleen Asari said that she volunteered for the Women Army Corps because I am proud that I am an American citizen. Unlike African Americans, they were able to be assigned to a variety of jobs that fit their educational background. Amongst them was Chido Isonga, who had lived and gone to school both in the US and Japan. She was working in Hawaii when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Her parents felt that Japan would win the war, but she still volunteered for the WAC. It was on the last day she was able to. Oak Ridge, Tennessee was the administrative headquarters of the Manhattan Engineering District. It was a secret city that housed thousands of workers. It included 3 plants which operated the uranium necessary for the atomic bomb. Some workers were involved in the project, but most of the individuals were employed at everyday jobs to keep a town running. They only had a little understanding of what the Manhattan Engineering Division was doing, and every person was sworn to secrecy and only given basic information that they needed to carry out their specific function. No more. A separate Women's Army Corps detachment was established on June 3rd, 1944, to supply female forces for the Manhattan Project. There were 74 women that were forced reported. Each of these women underwent a personal interview by the staff director, the WAC, who commanded Oak Ridge. Each woman was hand-selected for the assignment. Most of them were split between Oak Ridge and Los Alamos, but some were in Washington, D.C., Chicago, and New York City. By the war's end, 422 WACs served with the Corps of Engineers on the Manhattan Project. For the WACs, the MED installations were isolating. The tasks had such heavy responsibility, and Oak Ridge was under the utmost security because of the subject matter. Wilma Gray said, living in Oak Ridge was like living in a big cage surrounded with barbed wire. The WACs at Oak Ridge were stenographers, typists, clerks, and telephone operators. They handled reports and classified files. Typically, WACs were not used as engineers or scientists. It was actually mainly civilian women in these roles, such as Norma Gross, Mary Miller, and Myrtle Bachelder, who were working as chemists in Los Alamos Laboratory. Elizabeth Wilson served in the chemistry division and ran the cyclotron, which was used in experiments related to the development of the bomb. Many women still continue to find the WAC an interesting career, especially when signed to the Air Force, where they became known as Air WACs. The first recruits were assigned to office duties. They were working on operating listening posts for the aircraft and warning service. At its peak, in 1945, the Air WACs boasted over 32,000 women. Eventually, 40% of all WACs went into the American Air Force, where they worked in an increasing variety of roles. By January of 1945, 50% of WACs worked in assignments traditionally seen as appropriate for women, like stenography or typing. Air WACs served increasingly as weather observers, radio operators, control tower operators, and maintenance specialists. In this unit, about 1,100 Black women served in segregated units, as did smaller numbers of Japanese, 50, and Puerto Rican, 200 women. More than 7,000 Air WACs served overseas in all theater of operations. 3 received the Air Medal. Unfortunately, as in all war, there were WACs that lost their lives. On May 30th, 1945, 18 WACs boarded a C-47 cargo plane in Accra, British West Africa, present-day Ghana, destined for Robertsfield, Liberia. The aircraft's first checkpoint was over Takadore, Gold Coast. Then there were several distress calls, and then nothing. All available Allied aircrafts searched for the C-47 in the Gulf of Guinea with negative results. It was the biggest loss of life in WAC history. All 18 women and 3 crew members are still missing today. In the 6888, 3 members of the battalion died in a Jeep accident in July 1945. They were buried at Normandy American Cemetery, and the unit raised money for their burials. The WAC stopped recruiting in 1945. By this point, the war was coming to an end. They began demobilizing, and most WACs were discharged by the end of 1946. Only remained. The WACs finally got to go home to their families. 1/5 of the organization served overseas. Women left the military with memories that would last the remainder of their lives, and they were so proud of what they had achieved. They had their discharge papers, and they were able to receive Women's Army Corps medals, which is a military award that was created to recognize the service of women in the United States Army. It was awarded to any women who served, whether in combat or a support role, for at least 6 months. It is also awarded to a woman who was the member of the Army Reserve or National Guard for 6 years. After the WAC demobilized, the women were expected to resume their own lives. For lots of women, it was difficult to go back to the way things were. The men came back from the war and took all the jobs. Some women were happy to get married and start families. For others, it was a very difficult adjustment. Their lives changed, and the world changed for a moment, but it was back to being the same. Many women had difficult times getting benefits from the government and find any support that they needed. The gender equality barriers they hoped they had broken during the war were back in place. They would need to continue their gender equality efforts in the coming decades. The men received honors for their efforts, and besides the medals, if they received one, the women got little or no recognition from their peers. The Women's Army Corps Veterans Association, the WACVA, was organized in August of 1947. Women who had served honorably in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps or the Women's Army Corps and were honorably discharged were all eligible to be members. The Army fully integrated in 1978, so the Women's Army Corps was officially disbanded, and the women were able to join the U.S. Army with the men and attend the same training as their male counterparts. This was a way to show gender equality, and the leader of the WAC at the time, Mary E. Clark, was promoted to Major General in the Army. Although women officially got to join the U.S. Army, they were barred for some career specialties because of the combat exclusion policy. Oveta Kolb-Hobby stayed with the WAC after World War II. In 1978, she continued to lead the women in the U.S. Army as colonial. She also served as first United States Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and fourth Administrator of the Federal Security Agency under Dwight Eisenhower. She died in 1995 in Houston, Texas. Charity Adams married Stanley A. Early, got a master's degree in psychology from The Ohio State University, and became the director of student personnel at Georgia State College. She was also involved in community service projects that included the NAACP, United Way, and YMCA. She and her husband had 2 children named Stanley and Judith, and she died in 2002 in her hometown of Dayton, Ohio. Today, there are over 74,000 women in the U.S. Army. Although that's the highest number of women in the military, the women to men ratio is actually lower than the Navy and U.S. Air Force. 18 women graduated in the last 10 years, and these milestones have been reached. In 2017, the first gender-integrated infantry basic training for enlisted soldiers. In 2019, Laura Yeager became the first woman to lead a U.S. Army infantry division. In May 2021, Christine Warmuth became the first female United States Secretary of the Army. Note that she is a civilian leading the Army. In 2023, women make up 16% of our U.S. military. Women in the United States contributed to the war effort in so many ways, including military service. The WAC risked their lives to win the Second World War and free up their male counterparts to fight the Axis powers. They overcame gender stereotypes, sexism, harassment, to be part of the United States military. And contrary to what some people believed at the time, the US needed both genders to win the war. It was a group effort. The WAC was able to include all races in the military, although segregated. Some units and areas of the military did not include these groups. Black women fought against the racial barriers that raged in the United States military, and America hadn't seen it coming. These women would help drive the civil rights movement. The WAC seemed to get along, for the most part, okay with their male counterparts, even if they got an unnecessary wolf whistle here and there. And they were able to hold on to their femininity in ways that they could, and to say women could prove their loyalty to the United States when they served. Not every woman had an easy time in this organization, but some women came out very proud of what they did for their country and the world. And perhaps the toughest part was coming back from the war and not receiving a ceremonious welcome from their peers. Many women still wanted to work after the war, but they could not find jobs. They were shoved back into the domestic sphere without so much as a congratulations or thank you for your service from their fellow Americans. Luckily, in recent decades, the museum and historical community has honored these women through exhibits, interviews, and books accessible to the public. Now everyone can learn the sacrifices these women made for their country. It's important to know they assisted their male counterparts when they were called into action. You're welcome.